Okay, we're going to continue on with chapter 3 again, which is our first part of the foundations of adaptive code sections here. Um, and this is the second part because in the first part we talked about this basic dependency where you kind of in code where we can define a class dependent kind of on another one. And we talked about different ways of doing that. We created this console app. We talked about this, a message passing or a message printing service there. And we talked about putting that into a separate library there and creating a separate kind of project within our solution for that and how to set up dependencies so that and how then each one could be compiled separately and tested separately. And then we talked a little bit about these graphs and how these graphs can be set up so that or how we can look at dependencies and how can there be many dependencies and things like that for this. Now, some of this we're not going to worry too much about. Dependencies do get complicated often with, especially when you're bringing in external libraries. So it will be something you will work with quite a bit. We then talked about interfaces versus implementation here. Talked about what code smell is, and back to interfaces, we'll be using those a lot. And so rather than creating a class, we'll often create a class that fulfills an interface. And we looked at a simple example of that where we were creating an interface and doing that. Now, so here's an example, again, where we're creating a new security service here inside a class. So we're instantiating an object inside another object, which is okay, but again, it's not as what they're calling adaptive for future stuff. So the first thing we can do is have this, rather than having this an exact object, creating an interface for this. So we do talk about creating an interface for this and then setting that up to satisfy that interface. So here we're creating an interface, and then creating the object. When we create an object, it is of that interface type rather than of that particular object. So then we can makes it a little more easier to substitute stuff, but we're still again instantiating an object in here for this. Now we're going to get down to dependency injection, and we'll talk about that. So let's look at something different. So let's say we had a robot that made muffins, fruit muffin, like blueberry muffins, and it had a recipe, basically a class, built into the robot, and it could create, it would go out and get blueberry muffins, or it had to have blueberry muffins too. So it had a little stock of blueberry muffins inside of it or whatever, there. And so it could instantiate kind of blueberries to put in the muffins and fulfill its recipe each time. So that's a nice little step. But if we wanted to test out that robot muffin making thing, we had to make sure we had blueberry muffins on hand, and often we don't. And that's what we're talking about here. When we're testing these objects out and we're instantiating other objects, we have to have all those other objects around just to do a simple unit test. So if we just want to see if the robot can mix something in order to even start it up, it has to have blueberry muffins to do that. So rather than doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to set up the robot so we pass it in the blueberry muffins. And for that matter, we could pass it in any fruit. So rather than having it a blueberry muffin, we could have it an fruit recipe or interface to fruit. So we would pass it in fruit, and it would know that. And so that's what we often do with our classes. We create classes and we pass them in objects we want. Now we don't have to pass in everything. Like a muffin making object, we might not have to pass it in salt and flour and sugar, basic things like integers, strings like that that can be created easily. But more complicated things like maybe blueberries, or in this case here, let's look at this. So we're creating an account controller, and we're passing it in this service object. So we're placing, and then once we have that, we'll use that to do what we need to run our code and stuff like that. So rather than creating an object, so often when we're looking at code, if we see it instantiating an object, one thing you should ask is, do we need to instantiate the object? Can't we change that? So in the constructor, we pass in whatever objects that object needs here. And that's called dependency injection. We're injecting, passing in everything that all the dependencies that this object needs. So dependency injection means that we're going to set up parameters in the constructor, and we're going to pass in all the little tools that we need. So, if we have a robot that's making muffins, we're going to pass in everything. So we're going to pass in whatever fruit we want it to use there, and we're going to pass in, and maybe we'll pass in other things to it if it's instantiating other objects. So that's what dependency injection. And there's whole you should read through this, but there's a whole chapter later on. Chapter 12 is all on dependency injection, and there are whole books written about dependency injection, how that works. So it's a big common thing. There are whole libraries and things set up to do dependency injections and different things. So another thing we get into sometimes is resolving dependencies. Sometimes we will have interfaces, and sometimes we'll have libraries will automatically look for objects rather than passing them in, look for objects that will satisfy those interfaces and things like that. Also, if we're seeing something, how does compiler know where to do it? And so this is really dependent on the framework. So .NET uses the CLL, or Common Language Runtime, in the .NET framework to do it. It's kind of a just-in-time compiler. And again, we have Java virtual machines, Python. Each language has a little different setup. So I'm not going to go into too detail how this works in this. You can read through it, but it's not that critical. It is rather dependent on this sort of setup, and it is a little bit dated. There's newer ways that we're seeing to do this. So they're talking about fusion tables and stuff like that. So they're also talking about services and how we want to couple clients. So basically, what we want to do, we want to create little groups of code that are tightly coupled, a couple classes that work really closely together and form a little unit, a little library, or a little object, set, an assembly kind of. And then we'll have other ones of those. But then those objects will be loosely coupled together. So we want little tightly coupled cohesive units, and then those will be loosely coupled together. And one way we do that is talking about services or connections, ways to connect those stuff in different ways. So one thing we will mention is service discovery. So you could create a service, often like a web service, and then have your code try to look for that service in some ways. And again, this is kind of beyond the scope of this class, but this is how it works. When you take the mobile apps class where we do like Android stuff, it's similar. In there we have what are called intents. In the Android operating system, you can say, I just need some client or some service to send email, and so or a calendar service, and you don't know what calendar services are on the device, on the phone or whatever, but you just say, and the operating system goes and finds it. And so that's kind of the same sort of stuff. This is web based, where we're looking for certain services at an endpoint on the web here, and again talking about some mappings of that. So and again, working through service discovery. But again, we're going to skip over much of that. It also gets into RESTful services, and so often with RESTful services, you basically create your own service and set it up. So REST is a relatively simple web-based interface that's easy to set up. Like they say, they have very low dependency burden expected of the clients. You don't have to set up a whole session and log in and all that sort of stuff. You can just request data and get it back generally. So they're talking about setting up a class that will serve as a RESTful service here. And with web pages or with this sort of stuff, we have gets and puts and posts. Those are the web kind of interfaces that you use through web clients. So this just talks about defining those things. And again, RESTful stuff is kind of beyond the scope of this class also. So we'll just mention that RESTful services. And we actually will use some RESTful services later on in this class and revisit this. And this then talks about how in our main program we might access this. This might be running on a web server that we've set up, and here we're then contacting that web service, and we're doing a web request here, either a get or a post request to this address here, and then we're getting some information back. So this is how we're doing a get request. We're creating a client, we're doing a get synchronous a string, and this has to be done asynchronous and then we have to use what is called an await. And again, we'll revisit await later on in this class and some other classes to run this in a separate thread. And this is a post request, and again, we're creating an asynchronous post request here, and then again we have to do an await and set that up. But again, this is not something, but I mean, just wanted to show you that this textbook's going over, then kind of give you a brief view of what is going on here for that. So another area that this textbook talks about is libraries to manage dependencies, and .NET often uses NuGet here for this sort of stuff. And that will help you get the right dependencies. So we were talking like maybe above we were using a library for a database access, and that was using a Hibernate library. And so this would help you find the Hibernate library. And once you get the Hibernate library, that would probably require other libraries to be built in. And so NuGet will get whatever library you need, and then all the dependencies of that library also generally. And you'll sometimes see NuGet running in the background or stuff like that. So we will see it periodically throughout this course. I'd be interested if others have used other dependency packages, apt-get, like in Linux or Python, where you're again installing something, and then that is then installing all the dependencies that package needs. We usually often call these a package management object or interface. So if you've used any package management stuff, it'd be nice to this week post that to the discussion area and just describe what you've used. It'd be fun to see. So NuGet is our package management library here that will get these objects, get the packages and the dependencies we need. And again, we're not going to go over too much. We're going to try to ignore that. And then again, since we're in the chocolate or NuGet, we need some chocolate. So Chocolatey is another package management tool. And again, I'm not going to cover that at all there, but they're just there. Here. Now we're going to get on the layers, and we're going to start talking a little bit more about layers, because this is what we will be spending a lot of the assignments in this this unit on, is these layers. So often we want to break our project up into parts. And we'll often talk about the data model, keeping the data in one area, keeping the user interface in another area, and then keeping some sort of business logic in between there. So this talks about first how we often break up the user interface. We'll often have views, controllers, and view models that'll tie into the database there. And we'll set up some web applications that'll use this sort of framework here. View controllers and view models there. There are some other common layer approaches. So the most simplest one is we have our user interface, just our whatever our buttons and that sort of stuff are, and then we have our database underneath it. And these are often stored in two separate libraries or some sort of simple connection, calls to kind of keep these away from each other, so that we're not accessing the database directly here. And so if we wanted to swap out the database, we could change the database here and never have to change the user interface. And also, if we ever wanted to change the user interface, we should never have to necessarily change the database access stuff in a lot of cases. So this talks about the user interface, and again, often then what we're doing is plugging in a data access interface in here. Now, just so you pay attention, this user interface, we use the term interface here, just the generic English, a way to interact with the user. Now, this interface is more of the computer interface, where we're again using not an object but interface, an actual object-oriented interface as here. So this interface and this interface are slightly different in their meanings, and we'll be using interfaces a lot to separate. So anytime we have one kind of library and another library, we'll often stick an interface in between to control or limit how they access each other. This will also allow a much better for testing here. So we can test the user interface by just creating a simple a stub data object that just implements this interface. And here we can implement this without worrying about the data. We can just access this directly through the calls of the interface there. So. And again, we can talk about things that the data access stuff would do. It might be, doing queries to the database. It might be serializing and deserializing objects here. This is often a SQL database, or again, it could be a MongoDB or some sort of like a Firebase database, some non-SQL database here. And we're often using a framework here that'll map our objects into the database objects, into tables or whatever we have out there. And Hibernate is one of those. And we'll talk about these database object mapping kind of stuff here. So here's a 3-layer version of this. So again, we have our user interface, we have our business logic, and we have our data access here. This interface is often called, they don't say here, but this is often called a model view controller MVC. So this is our data model here. This is our view, our user interface, and this is our control, which controls the access back and forth. So this just adds some more logic, again, for doing, like I say, some things like serializing and deserializing objects into text strings or whatever we're saving, or JSON objects or something like that. Or else doing other logic things, combine, converting data from one format to the other, or making sure certain constraints are matched and stuff like that for us. So this is a more kind of breaks that down a little bit more. We have a user interface then, and again we have our domain model. This is our kind of internal data model, and we map that. So these are objects in our language, in like C# or Java. So these are our data in objects. And then we have the object relational mapper on ORM, like Hibernate or things like that. And this will, again, take these objects and map them into our database tables here and through SQL and stuff, or whatever, JSON or whatever. So we have this. This is often a built-in, or a library that's built to do that. We usually don't build this library to access the database here, but we set it up in our library, and we should see that in this class, and we see it in some of our other classes. So I'm not going to go over too much of the rest of this. But basically, at the end of the chapter here, we talk about some concerns and ways of setting this up. I'm not going to go over to this code too much, or this layering stuff. Instead, we're going to focus more on the libraries, model view controllers, and things like that in this unit. And so again, we're going to look at the code, and we're going to build some ASP some C# web pages, and just kind of look. So far we can kind of doing console. So we're going to, now I think you got a kind of handle on how this Visual Studio works and have it installed and everything. We're going to try to do some web pages. And so we'll look at a model view controller interface. So again, a data model, the views that the user sees, and then the controller in between. And ASP.NET uses this format for their web stuff, and we'll use something called ASP.NET. This is it's called active server pages, but I think it's usually just called the abbreviation ASP now. And then again, we'll build on that in different ways. So, and then in here, we'll do a club model and have you work on, again, the same sort of exercise with these web pages and how that works. So there'll be videos that you can watch in here to finish that up. Okay.